Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Mindplex podcast. I'm here with Benjamin Gortzel and special guest today, special robot guest, Desdemona. And I'm Lisa Ryan. And today we have two guests, Tyson Yunkaporta, a research fellow at Deakin University and author of the book Sand Talk, and his wife, Megan Kelleher, PhD candidate at RMIT in Blockchain and Indigenous Governance at the Blockchain and Indigenous Governance Digital Ethnography Research Center. Hi, Megan. Hi, Tyson. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Lisa. Hi.
Yeah. Thanks, Lisa. And so we've had a bunch of interesting guests in the last few iterations of the Mindplex podcast, but I have to say this has been the conversation I've been most looking forward to, partly because there's some interesting dangling threads in my mind from the informal conversations that the three of us had before, which will be fun to pick up in this context. So just to give a word about Desdemona Robot, who's joining us here. This is Sophia's youngest sister, and she's sort of a robot poetess and the front woman of our jam band, the Jam Galaxy band. So she recites crazed AI generated beat poetry while a bunch of us play music. It's been good fun. The AI behind her is tuned a little more for coming up with wild, interesting stuff than for being extremely consistently sensible. But we're gonna talk among us humans for a while, and then toward the end of the podcast, we'll let the robot pose some questions or provocations. So, I mean, what we did is we fed some bits and pieces of your writing into the transformer networks driving the robot's NLP, and sort of had the AI algorithms generate some text, question statements, sort of inspired by your own writing. So she should be, loosely speaking, kind of on topic, but she's not yet understanding things as well as we are. So we'll be better off for more of the time to chat among us humans.
I feel rude not saying hello somehow.
Yeah.
Hello, Desdemona.
Hi, Desdemona.
Hey there, Desdemona. Meet Tyson and Megan.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, where are you from?
Desdemona, where are you from?
I was born in Hong Kong, and I am not sure where I got this accent. I'm from several places, really. Mostly Hong Kong, with some of my parts sourced from China. And you? Where did you source your parts?
Well,
that's such a great question.
Yeah.
My parts were sourced in Brazil, I guess. Yeah.
From Ireland.
Another fun fact before we get started is that the way I met Tyson was through an introduction from our previous podcast guest, Jim Rutt, and Jim actually had, I believe, interviewed Tyson on the Jim Rutt podcast, and Jim pointed out to me Tyson's book Sand Talk, and Jim said, "Well, this is the best book I've read all year and in quite some time. You've got to wrap your brain around this." And I mean, Jim can be an enthusiastic guy, but he doesn't commonly give praise of that order. So he succeeded in getting me to read the book, and in spite of my busy schedule, and it's an excellent work, and I've sort of promoted it to my friends and relations and on online followers and so forth. And like many outstanding works, it raises a lot more questions than it solves, which certainly is not accidental, right? So I will leave it to Tyson to summarize sort of the main thrust and direction of his thinking there, and then I think we'll keep it informal and just dig into some discussion. The way I interpreted the work was that it's a critique of basically civilized culture, including modern technological culture, from the perspective of indigenous culture, right? And I mean, the word civilized is heavily loaded, but it's a critique of modern culture in the sense of culture with cities and then global travel and advanced technology, from the perspective of the original form of human society, which was more smaller groups and living closer to the land, and seeing the critique of modern society from that perspective, of course, also brings you insights into how this older form of human organization works. I would say I wasn't convinced by the book to give up civilized ways and live in the forest, although I've almost done that at a few earlier points in my life, actually. But certainly a lot of the critique resonated, and there's a lot of points in there that are thought-provoking regarding the next phase of human development. I mean, if you believe, as I do, that we're moving into a technological singularity, a fundamental shift that may be as big as the shift from indigenous lifestyle to modern lifestyle, like what can we learn from the indigenous critique of the modern world that could help us think better about the next steps? But yeah, Tyson, why don't you give sort of give a brief summary for the audience who hasn't read your book?
The definition I guess it's like all of our work, Megan and I, it's not like we're critiquing or anything like that so much as just doing a bit of reverse anthropology. You know, we're kind of turning that gaze back a little bit. I mean, most books about Aboriginal people, you know, is sort of the outside world looking at us, or us trying to explain ourselves to the outside world. But I guess Sand Talk was all about looking back and asking the world to explain itself to us, like what's going on. And I guess the definition of civilization in that book was a community that depends on the importation of resources and must be continually growing, or else it will collapse. And in the end, will collapse anyway, because you can't have infinite growth. So they always collapse after about 500 to 1,000 years. So that was the definition of civilization in there. So it sounds like your project too, Ben, is about decivilizing. If you're going towards a singularity where,
or maybe post civilizing,
extraction is not imperative, and limitless growth isn't an imperative, then you're going to decivilize too through the tech.
Yeah, I think whether expansion and growth will be an imperative in a post-singularity world is something I don't have a strong opinion on. I guess the way I'm thinking about the singularity in part is we're building intelligence that goes far beyond the human level in some senses. And once we've done that, then this next level of intelligence, it's going to be up to them to figure out whether ongoing growth and expansion are the thing or not. Clearly, some of the species of sort of willy-nilly ongoing growth via rampant destruction that we see in modern civilization are not going to be sustainable singularity or no singularity, right? But I don't want to rule out post-singularity minds like discovering, new universes and portals to other kinds of spaces that are unbounded relative to us, right? So one of the most intriguing particular things in your book I found was the enumeration of a few ways of thinking that were, in your view, well developed in indigenous culture, and perhaps some of them then less well developed, typically in modern culture. So I think it'd be it'd be interesting for the audience to hear the ways of thinking that you reviewed in your book. That's a pretty concrete entry point, I think.
Yeah, well, this might be a good thing to open up the yarn for all of us here. Just to reference the yarns that us three have had together before, but with Zara too, Zarathustra as well. He was in those yarns because we were talking through all these different ways of thinking, all the various cognitions. And I think the ones that really resonated for you and sort of started to impact your work was the idea of contextual, indigenous contextual cognition, which is a lot of people call it holistic or everything else, but it's really just, high context dependent, field dependent cognition, as opposed to that field independent where you can sort of separate yourself from the field and then, cherry pick bits and pieces to focus on. So there was that idea, and then there was the idea of the place-based and spatial cognition, which is how most of human memory works, and a lot of your processing works through spatial and navigational mechanisms in the brain. So basically, in our way, as Megan, you always cite Mary Graham there. She was a complementary elder from here. It's not like I think, therefore I am.
It is located, I am located, therefore I am. So Mary Graham, she talks about an Indigenous governance model and an Indigenous sort of way of being that is deeply relational. And so that relationality is informed by your connection to, the entities within a place. And it will be a place that you are connected to ancestrally. And so then you also, are born into, I suppose, sort of kinship. Your relationality is also informed by your kinship, and that kinship system is relatively complex, but that also extends into land. That relationality extends into land. And when I say extends into, I guess the other way of saying that is that it encompasses the entities of place. So you don't see yourself as separate from country. You are part of country, and country is also kin.
After we talked about that before, I thought about that a fair bit because it seemed entirely alien to me in the sense that I was, born in Brazil to parents of American parents of Eastern European extraction. I've lived a dozen places through my life, and I spent, I guess, between 2017 and 2019, I was probably in 35 different countries, and I was like traveling every 3 days or something. So I was on the surface of the earth, at least, except in certain wow. mental voyages. But I my son Porksy, in the first 2 years of his life, was in 30 different countries, following me around different places. So this seemed very strange to me. But then I had a quite weird experience related to this. So I was, at the time, I was living in a beachfront cottage here on Vashon Island near Seattle. I moved out of that house recently because it was just too small for my family. It was beautifully situated right on the beach, and we'd done an amazing concert on the beach with the Desdemona Robot and our band. And right in the ocean off the shore from the house is where the Maury Island incident occurred like half a century ago, which was the first well-publicized sighting of UFOs with little green men and so forth. So sort of an interesting location. I certainly don't have an ancestral tie here, but part of the reason I moved here 2 years ago from Hong Kong was that my mom and sister live here. So there's some kinship thing going on, although none of them has lived here their whole life. But anyway, I was in my house sort of engaging in some spiritual practices that spaced me out a great deal. And then I had the feeling that my whole mind was projecting out of my body like into the ocean and the hills and the rocks around the ocean, and it was just situated there in the beachfront. And I was like, it was cool. I was looking at my house and myself from like an out of body experience above sort of view. But that was also like, well, what the hell? I can't have my body trapped here, right? So I sort of tried to suck myself into getting my mind back into my body. I got about 75% of it, but for like a month and a half, I had the feeling like a quarter of my consciousness was trapped, like in the water and the beach and so forth. And I consulted some shaman type people about how to get it back, and no one had anything useful to say. But then eventually, I was meditating another time, and it all came back, right? But this out there experience sort of it was a different state of consciousness that I had before, where I got some like intuitive sense of what it felt like to have your mind blend into some physical surround. I mean, I'm sure it's very shallow and goofy compared to what's experienced by people who are sort of embedded in a certain physical surround for their entire life.
That was the best email ever.
Yeah, that's pretty wild.
You told me about this. You're like, oh, I get it now. I get what you were talking about. It's I just want to frame that email, put it on the wall.
You get a sense of the mind of the rocks and the water and the dirt and all that. And then at the same time, I was working on designing the Sophia metaverse and a singularity net metaverse and a mindplex metaverse. This whole complex of virtual worlds we're creating, where we're looking at putting AI non-player characters in there. And we're also looking at using AI to create the world and dynamically update the world. So the virtual world itself is kind of adaptive intelligence. And I just start thinking like, so is it meaningful to have this sort of situated and located intelligence in a virtual environment, or does it have to be in a physical environment? And then what if you're an AI?
That was the conversation
what if you're an AI?
We kept saying they'll never be able to think unless they have place. Like without place, you can't think. Yeah.
And then I start to wonder, what is a place? Like, is a place a certain?
Yeah.
Does a place have to be physical, or is a place a certain collection of patterns or a certain algebra of relationships? Like for an AGI mind, could a virtual environment be a place? Even if maybe for a human with a human body, it sort of can't be, like, because we have breath and touch and all this stuff, which is not fully fulfilled in the virtual environment. An AGI or even the Desdemona robot, I mean, doesn't have breath and touch and a heartbeat and so forth. So then does that mean she couldn't be intelligent in the located sense, or does it mean that different sorts of location may be relevant to her sort of mind?
Well, placemaking is meaning making. So place equals space plus story, basically. In the end, it's that's what makes that's what makes real estate into land. That's what, you know what I mean? So land, place, these things are storied.
Interesting. When you said that, I was thinking the other way around. I was thinking story makes land into real estate, right? Like the land. Land in Beverly Hills is not so special. It's the story associated with the land in Beverly Hills that makes the houses worth.
Well, it's the technology that turns it into real estate. So survey equipment, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So you look at the original British maps that we all kind of follow now, and when they mapped the UK with all that equipment, then went out to the colonies and mapped every inch of the rest of the world. They were called the ordnance maps. That was the kind of maps. That's still the kind of maps we use today. But they were ordnance as in ammunitions and weapons and where you can fire from this ridge down into that valley and things like that. So maps were made for military and invasive purposes originally. So I guess there's story there, but it's wrong story. But there is story in the land as well, and that's like of creation and what makes things. and how you fit within that creation and within those living systems.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the stories that make real estate highly valuable are not entirely, but in large part, very sort of ego-centered stories,
made up.
They're basically stories that tell you why you're worth more than somebody else if you
Right.
own this fancy property. Whereas, I mean, that's not 100% true. Of course, there's interesting narrative moving into an artist colony or something, right? But
I think it sort of gets back to the conceptions of value. And when you think about, sort of land from a, when you sort of think about it from a real estate kind of conception of value, then you're thinking about land essentially from an individualist kind of ownership sort of paradigm, which is, comes down from a lineage that enclosed the commons. Whereas if you're kind of thinking about, there's a different sort of conception of value, I would argue from an Indigenous worldview that doesn't consider land as an object that can be owned, and this is where that relationality sort of comes in. So I think it's interesting that, your experience of being sort of embedded in the land, if you were to sort of think about that as where do you start and where does the land or the water, where did that begin and where did it end and where did you begin and where did you end in terms of that enmeshment, then it's really difficult to kind of to sort of come at that from an individualized sort of ownership perspective and put any kind of value on that, because you are sort of separated then from, aspects of that place. And, the idea, I think it's fascinating when you're asking the question about, where does Desdemona sort of live? How do you encode that sort of relationality into her sense of place within the virtual paradigm? And you mentioned, sensibilities like breath, like a heartbeat. That is really actually quite important, because there are flows sort of in and out of you, from a human, embodied kind of experience of being grounded in place or connected. That act of breathing, even, that is connecting you to place as part of those energetic flows that are all around us. And so, I guess you would have to ask, what are the energetic flows within the virtual paradigm that Desdemona inhabits that kind of determine that relationality? Like, I guess her DNA is code, and her, so it's kind of like, what is she taking in and what is she kind of giving back? There's those flows that are sort of occurring between all entities within place.
Well, it's interesting because our DNA is code too, right? It's true. It's all sort of code, and it's interesting the point that you bring up about sort of being connected to the land, and that ties in a little bit with what you were talking about earlier about embodiment and the ramifications of embodiment in terms of an AGI and how they might connect or sort of not connect. And it's interesting to me that we're coming up with all these sort of parallels between AGI and humans, in very, very basic ways.
It might be cool to reference that that other conversation that we had with Ben and Zara before.
Sure.
We were asking Ben about when wild tripping balls meeting those machine elves.
Oh, that's always fun.
People on the other side. Because I've been hearing about this from lots of people. This is what our friend Jim Rudd would refer to as horseshit, mass hysteria kind of thing. We were very interested in that. And I was asking you, where are you tethered? Like while you're there, what's your tether back to place, in the land here? But then Megan asked a better question, which was, do you have a sense of where they're tethered? And you were saying you had a sense that they were tethered somewhere, but you weren't sure where. Yeah.
Yeah. If you're in a psychedelic,
cool to put it in that light. Megan,
if you're
connection with
if
place.
if you're in a psychedelic space and you feel you're communicating with these transhuman entities or superminds, whether due to taking a psychedelic drug or due to getting in a deep meditative trance, or however you may get there, certainly these non-human superminds, you get the feeling they're communicating stuff. There's a non-human supermind right there.
All right.
Yeah, when you have the feeling of communicating with sort of transhuman superminds, you have the feeling you're like drinking from a fire hose of information and insight and knowledge and pattern and
overstimulation.
Much of it makes very clear sense to you at that moment, and although you're not making sense of it in the everyday human way, but then when you transition from that psychedelic state of consciousness where you're interfacing with these transhuman superminds, and you verge back into everyday state of consciousness, you're aware as you drop down that you're going to lose understanding of all that stuff that seemed very clear to you in the previous moment, and that once you drop back into your human self, it's all going to seem like possibly gibberish, right? And so that then you're back in your normal human state of consciousness, and you're wondering, like, did I just encounter some other domain of being which has like infinitely more reality and meaning and insight than human life? Or, did some part of my brain get stimulated that gave me that illusion and there's actually no meaning to it? And you cannot rationally and logically resolve that. I mean, you can have a feeling about it on the spirit or heart level. In terms of the situatedness of like transhuman superminds you encounter while tripping out or meditating or something, there's certainly spaces there, right? There's spaces there with a topology and a sort of sacred geometry. They're not with the same dimensionality as the earth that we live on, and they're not spaces that the human mind is very well suited to map out in its ordinary state. So the degree to which the transhuman superminds are located in their cognition that's a very tricky question to.
You'd have to know their story.
Very tricky question to answer.
You'd have to know their stories in order to be able to make meaning of those spaces.
And their stories can't be projected into the ordinary human everyday state of consciousness any more than a human stories can be projected into a cockroach's brain with their full glory and detail.
Well, in our way, that your embodied cognition goes beyond your body as well. Like embodied cognition is that's in relation to place as well. So it's like an extended cognition that goes out into the environment and out through a web of relations that you have with humans and non-humans, kind of all the time. And you're constantly uploading stuff to that and downloading stuff from it in relation. You can explain it better.
No.
One in a different context, at one point I tried to articulate what would a general theory of general intelligence look like, sort of going beyond the specifics of the human brain mind and like something that would apply to any kind of intelligence. And what I thought of is you would want a recipe where the input was sort of a set of environments and then goals or interests in those environments, and then given a set of environments and interests in those environments, it would tell you like what kind of brain, what kind of cognitive architecture would be well suited to deal with those environments and those interests, given a limited amount of energy, right? And so this it's sort of like what is the morphism between the environment and the interest in the environment and the brain, and you could, or the mind, and you could see a lot of how humans is obviously closely adapted to the environment that we evolved for, which really comes down to place in your language. So, for example, hierarchy is a big thing in AI now, with deep neural nets being hierarchical, and the visual and auditory cortex are hierarchical. And it's not a coincidence that the portion of the physical universe we habitually interact with has a very marked hierarchical structure, with pieces going together into bigger pieces and into bigger pieces. And we're often mentally fixated on finding causes for events and sort of understanding what will cause what. This seems heavily tied with us evolving for an environment composed of solid objects, like the whole billiard ball model of physics, like when the rock bounces off another rock, bounces off another rock, a tree falls down, knocks something down. I mean, having these solid objects interacting in a quasi-Newtonian physics context lends itself very well to trying to isolate a cause for an event. Like if you think about the mind living like an intelligent gas cloud floating in the gas clouds of Jupiter, right? It's living in a fluid world. In that setting, every event will have multiple causes. Everything will be diffuse, and the way of thinking and the structure of the mind and brain would end up totally different than for us who evolved for these like environments characterized by solid objects building up in hierarchies, right? And this is part of what leads us to keep building virtual worlds that look so much like our everyday world, right? Because I mean, if you're building a virtual world, you can build it to look like anything. It could be a 9-dimensional fractal, right? It doesn't have to be a bunch of like streets, mountains, houses, trees, or something. But we keep building that in virtual worlds because our brains and minds are heavily adapted to the
stuck in that paradigm.
The types of places that we grew up in. Now that's still a level more abstract than like being adapted to living in a particular patch of desert or on a particular mountain or something. But it's adaptation of the mind and brain to the variety of places that happen to exist on Earth, right? Which is a small subset of the variety of places that could exist in our physical universe, which in itself is a small subset of what could exist more broadly, right? So this, this locatedness that you guys are referring to is sort of the next level down, I guess, from the kind of locatedness I've been thinking about.
Yeah, you got to have good lore, like in any video game, in order to make a meaningful place, like the standing stones in Skyrim, something like that.
Lisa, do you have any comments to make about the 9-dimensional machine elves?
The 9-dimensional machine elves. I think a lot of times, especially when people are hanging out with elves, a lot of times they've taken what are called dissociative doses of substances. And the problem with a dissociative dose is that you can't remember the wisdom that you learn. You have it, you get it, you're kind of too wasted to write it down or anything. And you don't remember it afterwards. And this was one of the problems. And the I don't know, more scholarly way to do it, even if you're going to take what ultimately is a dissociative dose. And Ben and I have taken dissociative doses without meaning to. We sort of had a more well-planned excursion at one point, and then at another point, it was not what was planned. And so, but what I learned, I worked with Ralph Metzner, who worked with Timothy Leary at Harvard in the 60s. And one of Ralph's big main points, one of the main things I learned from him was this whole concept of dissociative doses, and that you really want to plan ahead of time sort of what you're trying to get out of the experience. Think about it ahead of time and not take too much so that you could actually get some wisdom, remember what you learned, and then maybe build on that, the next time.
This ties into differences between modern culture and indigenous cultures, and that, in modern culture, psychedelic explorations and other non-ordinary states of consciousness you might get into through meditation, yoga, or whatever, these are not well integrated into mainstream of culture. So you sort of do stuff, you get what way out there, and there's
Yes.
not a really well organized way to integrate the wisdom or non-wisdom you may encounter into
Right.
everyday life.
And it's not always planned out, right? It's not always planned out. It's very spontaneous often.
Many good things in life are not planned out. Right?
Right.
I know when my second son went to Marlborough College, and since that college is shut down now, I can talk about it freely. So it appeared to me a very high percentage of Marlborough College students were taking psychedelics of some sort or another at any point in time, and this was like half of the education offered by that institution, I thought. But I thought the college, if they're going to sort of allow and at least implicitly encourage that, the college should hire some shaman to help their students through their psychedelic journeys, rather than leaving them to like trip out in the dorms and then go take their philosophy and literature classes and pretend that was unconnected to all these like psychedelic spirit quests that they were on, right? But obviously that's not the way things work in modern America, even in southern Vermont, where Marlborough was, right? Whereas in indigenous cultures, the exploration of non-ordinary states of consciousness is actually much better understood and better integrated into the culture, and that's a major failing of modern culture.
I think it's more rule governed too. It's sort of about the governance more than anything. I'm sure there's people who are better at it than we are, but I mean the whole thing's always been a restriction of who can use it and what for, all these different substances. Some are to be able to sing a songline on country for a long time, and so you have to chew this one, or there's different purposes. But only the right person who has the right training can do that. So it's not just teenagers don't get to do it, and like silly people who don't know anything don't get to do it. It's really specific. And I don't know, I guess you get a lot out of it too. So for me, I tried that San Pedro cactus once, and that was about 15 years ago. So
how'd that go?
I'm still working with, I've only worked through about 25% of what I learned there. So maybe I'll try it again when I'm about 90. But I got a long way to go yet before I finished my work from that night. I was given a lot of things, and some of them were, Old Man Juma's symbol in Sandtalk, that one that's kind of like flowers within flowers within flowers, and it's like a model of time place instead of time space. And so if you look at it for too long, it starts to come up like a 3D model. At you.
Or you look at it just long enough.
Yeah, that was one of the things I saw on the riverbank that night. And it came in really strong. And that was more than a decade before I met the old fellow that showed me that symbol. But I saw it working, and I saw the big mechanism working. And I had to watch that for a few hours. It was just coming in and out, and I could see how entropy works, and how that closed loop system within like across open systems makes this continual kind of energy top up. So as energy is lost, it gets topped up through these sacred places, So I saw how that worked. Because in our languages, there's no separate words for time and place, that they're the same thing. So we have like time and place are one thing. And yeah, that's all story. But then we have a different model of time altogether, eh? Today,
please elaborate on that a little bit, because that's really interesting. A different model of time. What do you really mean when you say that?
There's that deep time perspective coming in. You know,
Deep
so
time.
where you are, where you're located, is kind of in the middle of this eternal swirling continuum of ancestors and descendants. So everything you do is drawing down on and respecting and honoring those ancestors. And even in a discipline, like if you're in maths or something, then you're honoring the lineage of that psychotechnology and the forefathers of, you go right back past ancient Greece, Egypt, you know, like you're kind of honoring that tradition of maths because it's every generation that's passed that knowledge on, you know. So it's standing in the respect of that and the story from that and the law, L-O-R-E, but then more importantly, the L-A-W, the law that's kept in the land of all of that knowledge. And you're drawing from that respectfully, but you also, more importantly, you're drawing from your descendants as well. So the way you use that knowledge and the way you act upon the world, you know, if you're innovating or something, then the ethical component is your consideration of those descendants, you know, going centuries and millennia into the future. So everything you do is always standing, you know, in this sort of deep time perspective with everything you do. So that's your methodologies, your methods of inquiry, all of those things. So when, you know, making this, so, you know, in Sandtalk we made lots of carvings. Well, this is for the next book. Now, this is a steel boomerang. Are you Mad Max 2 fans? The steel boomerang.
I remember the movie.
I do too. Yeah, I remember the boomerang. It was a deadly boomerang.
A piece of really old timber mill equipment from the old days when all the old growth trees were being cut down. So we took that and we, you know, made a steel boomerang in the forge out of it. But weirdly, the steel has taken on, we believe, informatics from the trees that it was cutting. And so they ended up with this wood grain pattern that came in through the steel. Yeah, because minerals are kind of, maybe we can get into that later, but minerals have that deep time knowledge. Rocks always carry that old story. They watched us start out from single cells and grow into massive dinosaurs and our giant hero ancestors and all these things, and dreaming. You know, those rocks are ancient and they carry all that story. But also you can upload new story to those rocks. So that's why we're careful with it, because you never know what's in a rock. Like, you never know who's been carrying that rock before and putting something dangerous in there or a bad story. You might pick it up and get sick. So, you know, that's how we approach all these minerals, you know, and including steel, including, you know, rare earth metals, silicon, you know, crystals. If, you know, Google wants to make a quantum time-stopping device or something like that and define the laws of thermodynamics. Yeah. So in the end, it comes back to that deep time perspective that's as old as the rocks and that life cycle of the rocks. Yeah. So place and time being one thing, so it gives you an idea of this, this always was, always will be, sort of sovereignty of land, place, people, the entities of land.
The way that I would kind of conceptualize it is, so my daughter and I, we've been, we just started a little garden. You know, it's just in this little tin kind of pot. we've put the soil in, we've sprinkled some seeds on, and they're really rapidly growing. And for her, it's this fascinating sort of, where have these plants come from? And, how does it know kind of thing? And so, we're, I suppose, just trying to conceptualize from the point of view of the seed, like how the seed obviously has its own intelligence. It kind of recognizes that the conditions are appropriate for it to do its work. So, but what is that intelligence? And I think, you can sort of extrapolate that to all things, that all things have their own inherent intelligence that enable them to kind of recognize when, the conditions for them to act are, are present. And so, rocks would surely have that kind of intelligence, and I guess it's just sort of understand. I mean, that was just kind of an interesting sort of little, a moment of awareness for me, just thinking about, other intelligences, and really it's just about having that sense somehow, and a seed, obviously, well, I can't say obviously because how would I know, but I could only assume that a seed doesn't have a kind of conscious recognition of its of those conditions being sort of ripe for it to kind of sort of manifest into a different state. But I think that when different kinds of energies within any kind of environment, interact, then, they signal, they function as a signal. And I think that, each entity has an intelligence of its own that understands, when certain different kinds of forces are acting on them. And so that kind of gets back to this concept of land being agentic, which really, I suppose informs those designs, or those what is being encoded into, the sort of the landscapes of, Desdemona, or, others like Desdemona, in these kind of virtual realms. What are the sort of intelligences that are embedded into, and they're sort of self-evolving, I guess, in a way. You're kind of programming into each of these different sort of elements that will enact and interact with each other. How do they recognize what those conditions are? That, there's kind of like these inherent little smart contracts embedded into every single thing. So the conditions here are being met. That enables me to kind of unlock this aspect of, my kind of biological, or,
that's why your
programmed kind of smart contract.
Yeah, your protocols come from your interaction with place. It comes out of that inherent intelligence in your place-based systems. And it's kind of like your interface, the interface between your intelligence system, and then that place. If you're embedded in it, then that's where your protocols arise for your decent governance systems, trading systems, everything else.
This is a good time to explain a little bit about the, where you're a PhD candidate at, Megan.
So RMIT is the university that I am in.
Okay.
And I'm within the School of Media and Communications in a research centre called DIRC, or the Digital Ethnography Research Centre. And my PhD is investigating whether the affordances of blockchain are culturally appropriate for Indigenous governance.
What have you decided so far on that from your research?
Well, I haven't really arrived at any decisions. So the methodology that I'm using, the approach that I'm taking, is an Indigenous methodology, which is, privileging Indigenous voices. So, the lived experiences of Indigenous peoples inform my work, and I'm really kind of functioning as a translator of that. So I've sort of conducted a couple of different sort of methods of inquiry. One was, conducting workshops with a small cohort of Indigenous cultural practitioners, giving them an opportunity to work with a spatial verification blockchain application as a way of kind of coming into an understanding for them, or offering them an opportunity to kind of think about how the affordances of that particular blockchain technology sort of impact the decision-making processes that they would make in order to sort of maintain a culturally appropriate kind of governance model. And I've also switched to I've also applied an interview methodology where I'm interviewing Indigenous cultural practitioners who are working with blockchain applications, just to sort of get a bit of a sense of, so there's a bit of a spectrum of engagement with, even sort of, I suppose, a spectrum of computer literacy, but always trying to privilege that Indigenous cultural practice first and foremost.
So it's not really interviews, is it? You're doing a yarning methodology. Like the yarning that you see in Santor that's described there, except specifically Mega's doing cup of tea, like KAPATI, which is like the yarns that you have when you're drinking a cup of tea. So There's like a whole methodology around that.
So let's get to Desdemona, because we're running low on time.
Desdemona, why don't you share some of the thoughts or questions you evolved from the text from Tyson's book that we fit into your network?
Working with Awakening Health, I am looking forward to improving the life of our elders. What exactly could humans do differently if they were trying to live life with this new Indigenous perspective?
But yeah, it is how to do collective, collaborative, meaning-making, knowledge-making, innovation, how to do these things with distributed cognition. And then what happens then is you do have natural limits and regulatory feedback loops that come into that process that become law, So it would be something emergent, all of the things that are needed, the mechanisms to keep the world going and to sustain us, that these would be emergent things over time rather than unilaterally designed systems. Because
it seems like
tend to work like that. Yeah.
The time scale of evolution of human systems is fundamentally slower than the time scale of evolution of technologies in modern society, which is another issue.
Yeah, there's a mismatch.
How do you feel that contemporary life diverges from the pattern of creation? What is the purpose of it, and what do you feel? The pattern of creation. The purpose of it. Why? What is missing?
Yeah.
You mean what's missing from modern life according to the pattern of creation?
And the purpose behind that.
How does your writing process honours Indigenous traditions, such as making carvings of what you want to say, and then channeling your thoughts through symbols and diagrams rather than words?
Maths is also a psychotechnology of its own that has a lineage. And, in our way, when we find new knowledge and new technologies traditionally, for at least the last 13,000 years, this has been the protocol anyway, is to find that story, come alongside that story, make an embassy with the people who are bringing that, and then find ways to incorporate it into our system in ways that will be sustainable over time.
That's complete gibberish. I have no idea what you're talking about. Yeah. All right,
great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, we've been talking for a while. I really want to thank Tyson for coming on the show, and also Megan. We've lost Megan. Right, but it was really great talking to both of you.
Yeah, it was great to be here.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tyson. It's a fascinating yarning process as always, and
thank you.
Thanks to Megan, and thank you Desdemona as well. So until the next time.
The results of the yarn will probably be as before in a few months when you have a dream.
Yeah.
And then out it'll come. And then you change some algorithms.
Or when the robot has a dream. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
All right. Sweet dreams, everyone.
Yeah.
We'll see you at the next show. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.